Well, good morning, everyone. We'll get things underway. Thanks very much for joining this webinar this morning. My name's Robert Speed. I'm the Director of Water Quality for the Great Barrier Reef Foundation. And of course, the webinar is to talk about two new regional water quality programs that are commencing as part of the Reef Trust Partnership. The content today covers two separate calls and two separate regions. So it is a little complex, I know, but I'm sure if you've read through the material, at least I hope if you've read through the material, it's clear the different components we're looking at, but certainly the intent of today is to provide some more clarity on that. We elected to have a single briefing that covers both regions, and as I say, both calls, the expression of interest call for delivery providers, and then the separate request for proposals related to the program manager and partnership coordinator roles. We're running them as a single briefing because there is obviously a lot of commonality associated with the content, and I'm sure a lot of people who are interested in understanding both or all of those roles well. We have really as long today as we need to answer your questions. I think we have an hour and a half set aside. If that's not enough, if there are other questions, then we can take those on notice, or also happy to arrange a further webinar if it's apparent that that would be helpful to those of you who are interested in these roles. And particularly, I'm mindful for the request for proposals related to the program manager and partnership coordinator, that those interested in those roles may be looking for some more detailed feedback on what's involved. If it's apparent that it's worthwhile having a separate webinar for that, then we're certainly open to that as well. You'll note that you're all muted. That's simply because I think we've had 55 or 60 people online when I last looked. So it's obviously not possible for us to answer questions on the fly from everyone, but there is of course the question function there. So look, please send through your questions as soon as you can, as soon as you think of them, and then that'll allow us to collate them and group them and whatnot, and then respond to them at the appropriate time in the presentation today. So jumping into things then properly, firstly, just a very quick overview of the Reef Trust Partnership. I'm sure you're all broadly familiar with it. It is, of course, an agreement between the Australian Government and the Great Barrier Reef Foundation, a total $443 million grant over a period of 6 years. The objectives, the outcomes and so on are all set out in detail in the grant deed, which is available online, and also captured in various other documents that the Foundation has prepared, including the partnership strategy and the annual work plan, again, both of which are online, and which I'd encourage you to look at and to read to get a better understanding of the overall context. The overall objective, of course, is to achieve significant measurable improvement in the health of the reef over the term of the partnership, and the outcomes relate to improving management, protection, and addressing key threats, including poor water quality. The $440 million is allocated within the grant agreement, so that the boundaries are set there by the federal government through the agreement, and there is $201 million that has been allocated for water quality improvement activities, and obviously funding for a range of other activities which are shown there on the screen, but I won't talk through those. We're obviously talking today about the water quality improvement component of the Reef Trust Partnership. So the purpose of the water quality component, as per the agreement, is to address water quality improvement targets through such things as improving farming practices, fertiliser use, new technologies, and and better land management practices. The Reef Trust Partnership is very much tied to the Reef 2050 plan and the Reef 2050 Water Quality Improvement Plan and their objectives. And our prioritisation process in the foundation has been very much guided by the priorities that are set out in the Water Quality Improvement Plan. The annual work plan for the Reef Trust Partnership, which was completed at the end of June and is available online, it sets out the broad approach to investing, the $201 million. And you can see there on the screen now the areas that funding is going towards. There's approximately $20 million that has already been committed through early investment activities. That was through a grant round that opened late last year and for projects that commenced early this year and that are running for between 1 and 2 years. So there's 11 projects in total under the early investment activities spread across a range of catchments dealing with water quality improvement. That round of funding was focused very much on investing in proven methods and in maintaining delivery capacity on the ground. So for those of you familiar with that or who might have applied for it unsuccessfully, I'd just highlight that there were criteria that were put in place for a particular purpose at that time, and while some of those criteria will remain relevant, there are others that are not as important in this round. Secondly, you'll note there's a $20 million allocation in the annual work plan for traditional owner-led water quality improvement activities. So that work is current, or that funding has not been committed as yet. There is work ongoing to establish appropriate governance arrangements to allow decision making by relevant traditional owners and traditional owner groups, which will then ultimately inform what activities are funded through that work stream. There is $10 million that has been allocated for innovation and systems change. There is some more detail again set out in the annual work plan describing the priority areas for investment. So there are 4 areas that we have identified as priorities. Again, I'll let you go and read those and not talk to them now. I would highlight though for those that are interested in this space that there will be an open call for expressions of interest that we hope to release in the next few weeks, looking for proposals, for ideas around innovation and systems change that align to the 4 priority themes that are set out in the annual work plan. There's a further $10 million that has been set aside for conservation and protection activities in less disturbed catchments. Again, there is ongoing work to identify the priorities for that particular investment. So there's that's still in the planning phase, that particular element. And then finally, the largest component of the funding, so the $141 million, has been allocated at a regional level. So we have identified in the annual work plan lumps of funding that will be allocated at for particular catchments and to address particular pollutants. And that is, of course, is the funding that is relevant for the calls that we're talking about today. You see there on the screen now a breakdown of where that funding will go. And so notably, you'll see there the $22.7 million for Pioneer and Plain Creek, and $19.5 million for the Lower Fitzroy and Mackenzie. You can also see there the other regional programs that are intended, including a number that will have open calls go out, like the one that we're talking about today. We're expecting to put out those for the Herbert, for the Lower Burdick, and for the Mary before the end of the year. So the intention for, well, firstly I should say, so the approach to determining where this funding would go has been, I guess, an extensive exercise the foundation went through. I know I've talked to many of you on the line about that process in the past. You will see that available on the Foundation's website now is a report prepared by Alluvium, which sets out much of that process, which involved, I guess, a detailed technical exercise to understand the cost effectiveness of different interventions to help us understand where funding would get the best value for money. The priority areas also link very closely, as I said, to the water quality improvement plan, and all of the catchments that are shown on that map there are either high or very high priority areas under the WQIP. There was, I guess, more to the decision-making process than just those things, and as I say, you can read about that in more detail in the Alluvium report. I would highlight though now, and I'll come back to it later with one of the questions. In fact, there's been several questions that have come around this issue, that the work that's been done by Alluvium and other work done within the Foundation to come up with these priorities, that's been information which has been useful and allowed us to determine that, yes, we will invest this amount of money in this particular region. However, the assumptions that are embedded in the detail, for example, of the Alluvium report, are not limitations on what we will fund or where we will fund. So while that report may have assumed certain things, we have then made decisions at a higher level, and then we will then move. We've now moved into this sort of detailed design phase and grant phase. And so, for example, to the extent that the Alluvium report might have said that, you know, that 19.5 million in the Fitzroy is to be focused or is based on assumptions that this would be invested in stream bank restoration and grazing practice change, that means that we assume from the you know, the information that's available to us, those are the most cost-effective options available, and that's been the basis for us setting our targets for load reductions and so on. It does not mean, though, just to stress the point, it does not mean we're only interested in activities that align with those intervention types set out in the Alluvium report. As I say, that was a guide for our initial macro level investment. We will now look at all proposals on their merit. And so while the assumptions used by Alluvium might suggest that a particular activity will have one level of cost effectiveness, have a level of cost effectiveness, it's very much open to you as potential delivery providers or others to put forward a proposal for a different approach and to show us that what the cost effectiveness of that particular intervention would be. So as I say, just please take for what it is the Alluvium report. It is not gospel and it is not what is guiding all of our decisions moving forward. It has been used to guide our decisions around these priority areas and macro level allocations. It will be useful information for us, but it is not definitive in terms of guiding what we will and won't invest in. So the $141 million is to be invested through a series of regional programs. So the decision that's been made in the Foundation is that that will best be invested and best managed through these regional programs with a investment in the order of sort of $20 million or thereabouts, more or less in some regions, and with those regional programs as being the primary management unit. I guess this is recognising that we need to break down $200 million into effectively bite-sized chunks, and those regional programs are one of those bite-sized chunks. That's not to say that, well, I should say, we are of course looking for synergies and integration across programs and across all aspects of the water quality component, and indeed across all aspects of the Reef Trust Partnership. But our primary focus will be on making each regional program work as its own standalone unit, but then also seeing how different activities can interact together. If there are lessons from one that we can draw into another, then that's great as well. If there are opportunities for cost savings and for synergies by implementing activities in multiple programs, then we would look to do that also. But in the first instance, from a design phase, and from this procurement phase, the focus is on each of those regional programs. And you may have seen posted yesterday, we had a question along these lines from somebody asking, can they put in a proposal that covers Mackay Whitsunday region, for example, but also would include activities in the wet tropics or in the Burdekin, with those calls not yet having opened. We're certainly interested in understanding the possibilities to do implement projects that can cut across and that can bring that draw benefits, and as I say, particularly if there are cost savings or synergies that we can have. But we also do need to, just from a practical perspective, design programs in the first instance that can stand alone. And so again, from a procurement perspective, we need proposals to show how standing alone a project would work in this region. Very open for you also to put forward in a proposal how it might benefit from being applied in other regions and what those benefits would be. So from a program governance perspective, so there's a figure up there now, and I'll talk for a while around this because I know it's an issue we've discussed in detail with many of you on the call, but want people to understand how this will all work, how it differs somewhat from some other programs and some other alternatives that we've looked at. Broadly speaking, there will be a series of regional programs, which, as I say, will be the primary management unit for investing the funds at the regional level. So the Great Barrier Reef Foundation is looking through this call to engage someone as a regional program manager and also someone as a regional partnership coordinator. And we'll talk in more detail later in the presentation about exactly what those roles are. Separately, we are looking through the expression of interest process to identify potential delivery providers who will implement on-ground projects. So just to clarify again, for this webinar and for this call, there are two separate processes that are running, but which are very much connected. One is the call for expression of interests. So there's an expression of interest guidelines and related application form that relates to the delivery providers that you see in the boxes at the bottom there on the slide. So we are calling for expressions of interest from organisations who wish to implement projects delivering water quality improvement on the ground within these identified catchments. So that is one part of the process. The second is the request for proposal-professional services. So they're two separate items you'll see on the tenders.net website. And the request for proposed professional services is looking for applicants, organisations to undertake this role, one, of regional program manager, and secondly, of the partnership coordinator. The regional program manager will have overall responsibility for developing the program design for the regional program. They will do that in close collaboration with the regional partnership coordinator and also with the foundation. So the foundation will stay very closely connected with that process, and that will primarily occur through a program steering committee, which will include representatives from the foundation, from the regional program manager, and from the regional partnership coordinator. While the program manager will do the development of the program and will also be managing the delivery providers, they will oversee the delivery providers to make sure that they are implementing their projects in accordance with their the terms of their contracts. However, the contracts with those delivery providers will be directly between the Great Barrier Reef Foundation and that entity. So, so each of those entities will be contracted, will be accountable to the foundation, but the regional program manager will effectively operate as the agent for the foundation in overseeing delivery by those delivery providers, reporting back to the foundation that delivery providers have done what they were required to, or if there are any issues or concerns that need to be addressed. for the most part, managing those concerns, managing the risks, and so on. That's the role of the regional program manager. The regional partnership coordinator, as the name suggests, is about facilitating all of the relationships within the program between the program manager, between the delivery providers and the range of other stakeholders, landholders within the region, other projects that might be in the region, and so on. The objectives of this arrangement, which is, as I say, somewhat different from what has existed in the past, is really about having greater clarity and greater transparency and greater accountability of roles. All of the functions that we've just described are currently performed within reef water quality projects, but we are, I guess, looking to clearly break down what the different tasks required are, so that we have, as I say, greater clarity, greater transparency over who is doing what, and that there is accountability for those roles which might otherwise be lost if they were bundled all into one, particularly if you saw, if we had all three of those roles, the partnership coordinator, the program manager and the delivery provider all rolled in, then much of that transparency and accountability can be lost. It also recognises that there are different skill sets that are required for some of these roles, and that they don't necessarily have to be the one organisation, that there can be an organisation that has good skills to perform one of the tasks but not the others. And so part of the reason of teasing apart these roles is to allow, I guess, greater competition in the process, that there are more, there's more opportunity for a broader range of providers to come forward, which we see as being a good thing. It's also recognising potential conflicts that can exist. For example, potential conflicts between that partnership role of seeking collaboration and encouraging support, and that there is, potential challenges to undertaking that role at the same time as being the program manager, who is, I guess, holding the whip hand and trying to ensure that people are implementing in accordance with their contractual obligations. Those are the objectives behind the governance arrangements. I would like to stress, though, that we are flexible in the way we ultimately implement the program, and we really will focus on establishing arrangements and engaging organisations who will deliver the best outcome. We're very much outcomes focused in what we're trying to achieve here. So we want to understand, we will, I guess, and we have left both the expression of interest and the request for proposals reasonably open in terms of how you as potential providers might pitch your services, so that we can, as I say, look at what combination of skills and management arrangements is going to deliver the best outcome for the program and ultimately for the reef. And with that in mind, you'll see in the EOI and in the request for proposals that we are open to appointing a single entity to undertake more than one of these roles. For example, a single entity to fill the role of program manager and partnership coordinator. We are certainly open to that. What we would be looking for then in a proposal is for the applicant to identify how they would still be addressing or achieving these objectives that I've just described. We recognise that there would be, in some instances, benefits from that. There will be synergies potentially from having one organisation perform two roles, that there could be cost savings and so on. So we would encourage you, if you're putting forward a proposal in that way, to highlight what those benefits would be, what those cost savings might be of performing the multiple roles, but also how you see that you can address any of these concerns that might otherwise exist around accountability or around conflicts of interest and so on. So again, this next slide was just to highlight what this current call is about, that there are the two roles that relate to the request for proposal, so the program manager role and the partnership coordinator role, and separately then that there is the expression of interest for the delivery provider role. I'd also just note here that we, as well as these different roles, we of course have 2 different regions, the Mackay Whitsunday region and the Fitzroy region. If you are interested in submitting for both of those regions, then you need to submit a separate application for those. So for example, as a delivery provider, you would need to put in one for the Mackay Whitsundays and a separate one for the Fitzroy under the EOI. You're also able to put forward more than one expression of interest in a single region. If you have multiple projects that you wanted to pitch and you want to pitch those separately rather than as an integrated whole, then you're welcome to put forward more than one expression of interest. For the program manager and partnership coordinator roles, if you are interested in submitting for both of those roles, so for your organisation to take on both the program manager and partnership coordinator role, then you can submit that as a single application for one region. So if you want to do that for the Mackay Whitsundays, you can put in a single application for the one region. If you want to do that across 2 regions, then you would need to submit 2 separate applications. I hope that is clear. So as I noted, these are the first of the regional programs to kick off, Mackay Whitsunday and the Fitzroy region. So for the Mackay Whitsunday, there are 2 priority catchments that have been identified, Plain Creek and Pioneer. And the target pollutants in those are dissolved inorganic nitrogen and pesticides. And again, and in response to a question that came in yesterday, I'd stress that what we are requesting here in these calls are for proposals and for that will address both of these pollutants and in both of those priority catchments. And so I note that in the alluvium report, it refers to only Plain Creek as being a priority for nitrogen and for pesticides, and that Pioneer is only a priority for pesticides. So that was drawing on the relevant priorities within the Water Quality Improvement Plan, and that was a basis for some of the work that was done by alluvium. However, that is not the basis for what we are now funding. So I would urge people to concentrate on what is set out in the expression of interest guidelines and the request for proposals, which is that we are targeting both of those pollutants, both nitrogen and pesticides, in both Plain Creek and Pioneer. You will see that there are also target load reductions that have been set. So these fall out of the modelling work that we did again with alluvium, and which is described in more detail in that report that is available online. So these are modelled numbers based on various assumptions around what we would expect if we invest in the most cost-effective interventions in these locations to achieve through the source catchment modelling at the end of the basin. And so we, the Foundation, have then set those as our targets for the program to say that through this investment we are looking to achieve that level of overall load reduction as a long-term model reduction. Those are obviously very important targets for us in the Foundation, but then also then become very important targets for these programs. And so we will be looking to develop regional programs that are moving towards achieving those targets and expecting the projects that come forward obviously to contribute towards those targets. And you know that I guess they sit there and serve as a constant reminder of the fact that we are looking for real end of system outcomes and to be able to demonstrate that there are real end of system outcomes that we are achieving from the investment, and that we expect that of ourselves at the Foundation, and will expect that of delivery providers who are implementing projects to be able to present what it is that they expect to achieve through any investment, any grants that they might receive, and then to deliver on that commitment. The second program, of course, is in the Fitzroy, and the priority catchments are in the lower Fitzroy and Mackenzie, focused on dealing with fine sediment. You'll also note in the call that we have identified what we refer to as additional catchments. The foundation is actively seeking further funding that it can invest in water quality improvement activities. We are confident that we will secure additional funding. I guess I say that to assure people that this is more than just speculative. The funding is not secure, and there's nothing we can invest in these catchments as yet. But we are, certainly hopeful that that funding will become available, and confident that we can make that happen. So with that in mind, we have run a separate prioritisation process to determine where our priorities would be for investing any further funding if it does become available. And that means that we then set those out here. So you see in Mackay, Whitsundays, that's the O'Connell and Proserpine catchments. And also in the Fitzroy, it's the Dawson and the Isaac. The intention then is for us to invite funding from those regions. And sorry, I've just realised that in the PowerPoint I've got up there for the Proserpine, that should show nitrogen and also should include pesticides there. So for both O'Connell and Proserpine, it's nitrogen and pesticides in both of those, and in addition fine sediment in the O'Connell, and then in the Dawson and the Isaac, it's fine sediment only. So the intention here obviously is to use this grant round as an opportunity to for people to put forward their ideas for projects in these additional catchments, so that if funding becomes available down the track, that we already have identified through this EOI process our priority or a short list of potential projects and proponents, and we can move very quickly into funding those activities. And so as a result, we're looking for proposals that relate to these regions as well. So you can put forward a expression of interest that relates only to the O'Connell or Proserpine, for example, as a standalone proposal, or alternatively, you could put forward a proposal that captures the priority catchments, Plain Creek and Pioneer, and then also builds into it I guess in a modular fashion to say this is how we would undertake if we have funding for the priority areas, and if additional funding was available, we could expand this to these regions, and this is what the method and what the costs and so on that would be involved. Those are simply the maps. I don't think there's anything particularly to talk about there, other than just to note that I know that there are often or are inevitably boundary issues regarding exactly where the catchment boundaries are drawn, and in some regions in particular that is a challenge. Our approach to this will be to be certainly to be pragmatic. We are not going to be out there and drawing a line in the sand and saying you can't deal with that other half of the paddock on the other side of the line because it's outside of the catchment. We're very much focused on what are going to be outcomes for the reef, and so to the extent that there are activities that may move into a grey area between catchment boundaries, then we're happy to work in that grey area. We also recognise, from a delivery provider perspective, that delivery providers need to be pragmatic in the way they deal with landholders and others on the ground, and that we are looking for sort of whole of system and whole of farm outcomes in our approaches. So we will be driven by that pragmatism in how we look at things and design the program. Ultimately, though, there are priority areas that have been set, and there do need to be boundaries at some point that we will bring in and say, no, look, we can't continue, we can't fund all the way up in that region. It's moved too far beyond where our priorities are, and it's clearly moved beyond what we might call the grey zone. So in summary then, $141 million, $22.7 million allocated to the Mackay Whitsunday program for those priority catchments, so only for those priority catchments, and similarly $19.6 million in the Fitzroy, again only for those priority catchments. That funding is to support, to meet the costs of this program manager and partnership coordinator roles, and the delivery, and then the delivery providers. So overwhelmingly, that is where the funding will go on the ground for delivering those on-ground activities. In addition, some of the funding will be used to fund an expert panel that will provide technical support across the whole of the partnership. So we are still in the process of determining exactly what those arrangements will look like, but we will be running a process to identify and establish a range of experts who can then provide support to us at the foundation and the partnership as a whole, but then feed through to provide support in hopefully what will then be a cost-effective way, but also a quality assured way to the different regional programs to support with things like water quality monitoring, design, and analysis of information that comes out of that sort of monitoring process. So that would be a resource that would be established, that would be then available to support different programs, and so some of that funding would be used to support that resource. So the partnership as a whole and the program run through to 30 June 2025, and so projects, and so we're looking to appoint a program manager and partnership coordinators who will hold that position for the duration. Projects, we are also open to running for that period, so that's sort of 4 years or thereabouts by the time things are up and running. We are very mindful of the desire for certainty amongst entities who are providing these services, and the benefit of having that certainty in terms of employing and retaining staff. So we are looking to support that to the extent that we can. However, in terms of running an adaptive process and ensuring there's capacity for us to be flexible and adapt to changing circumstances, projects, I should say, even if they are funded for 4 years, there will be some quite clear and firm review points and evaluation points when we would be reassessing whether this is the best investment, or whether there are other activities that are being undertaken in the region that are being much more effective, and that we should be reallocating funds in that way. So ultimately, the design process will tease out what that looks like and how long these projects can run for. But as I say, we're mindful of the desire for longer projects, but we're also mindful of the need to build sufficient flexibility into the program, and that we don't lock in 4 to 5 years worth of funding up front and then sit back and just watch how that goes. For the delivery provider roles, for the projects that we're requesting as part of the EOI, they have a minimum project size of $500,000. That's, I guess, to reflect the fact that if there are, that's again the sort of management unit that we are looking at a minimum to be administering through the foundation. We recognise that there will be much smaller projects that somebody might want to put forward, but we would see that as the role of others as a delivery provider to aggregate a series of projects together in a way that might form that level of funding. I've touched on this already, parallel process for both delivery providers submitting expressions of interest, and then the partnership coordinator and program manager roles through the request for proposals. And we've also talked about the fact that we can have more than one expression of interest and more than one request for proposal. If you're putting them in for different regions, then we need separate proposals. The process then from here So the calls are obviously open until the end of November. The intention is for us to have appointed the program manager and partnership coordinators before we all break for Christmas. So we hope to be able to, finalise that process quite quickly, within a matter of weeks of the call being settled. So the foundation will then be working closely with the program manager and the partnership coordinator as part of the design process. So the expressions of interest, that are submitted for the delivery role will be assessed by an assessment panel. It'll comprise I expect the program manager, foundation representative, and other experts that will draw into that process. And in the first instance, that is about establishing which of the proposals meet the minimum requirements for each of the assessment criteria to be considered as part of the design phase. So we'll go through them and do that assessment process. We'll then be notifying everyone who has applied, who submitted an expression of interest, whether or not they have proceeded to that next phase. So you'll either be advised that no, you didn't meet one or more of the criteria and the reasons why, or alternatively that yes, you have satisfied the criteria and that you're then being considered as part of the detailed design phase. So in parallel to that process, we're looking for the partnership coordinator to establish a regional partners forum as a means for engaging with stakeholders and getting input into the planning process. I just note here that again, we are flexible and very pragmatic and open-minded around how these things, such as the Partners Forum, is established. We are mindful that there are many existing bodies in various places that perform similar types of functions, and so we are open to the extent that someone comes forward with an option of integrating this into an existing mechanism. If we think that can work and achieve all of our objectives, then we're very open to that being considered. But in any case, there will be some form of forum established as a means for bringing partners together, and that would include a means for us bringing in those who are the shortlisted applicants to be part of the planning process. We are looking at a process which is, I guess, a combination of a top-down and bottom-up planning process. Top-down so far as there are clear objectives that have been set for us through the Reef Trust Partnership and also set by us in the foundation, what we are looking to achieve from the program, and so the program needs to align with those high-level objectives. But equally, we are supportive of a co-design process and recognise the importance of having those who have the greatest stake in the program, those on the ground, those who will deliver projects, those landholders who need to be involved, the importance of having them involved in the process. And so we are committed to bringing them into the process, into the planning process, recognising that there is constraints both from those high-level objectives, but also timeframe constraints. And the total, process we're talking about here is less than 6 months, and I know that we recognise that is optimistic for a detailed design process. I guess one of the points I would make on that is that we don't necessarily see there as being a hard line between the planning process and the delivery process, and that the planning process will presumably be perfected over time. We are eager to have some of the activities start as soon as we can, and if we can identify projects that are suitable and that we would consider, I guess, no regrets projects, and that we would see forming part of a regional implementation program of works, irrespective of how the plan falls out, then we'd be looking to fund those sooner rather than later. I guess the point being, we're not necessarily looking to finalise a plan in its entirety and to lock that down before we move forward with funding particular projects, if we can see that there is merit in doing so, and particularly if we can see that that would allow more time for some of the planning to be, for the planning to evolve and for greater stakeholder input into that planning process. Broadly though, we have I guess a planning process that will run, which will draw on those proposals that have come in the first instance as a means of seeing how they might be formed together to make an integrated program. Part of that will be looking at where there might be synergies between proposals that have come on, how they can be either merged or can operate side by side in a way that gets better outcomes from them. Also to identify if there are gaps, if there are clear gaps where there have been no proposals come forward, but where we think there is work required. And part of that would be understanding if there is some of the key, I guess, institutional architecture or the supporting infrastructure that's necessary to make these sorts of programs work. If we, while we are overwhelmingly focused on cost effectiveness and projects delivering on-ground outcomes, we do recognise that there is a need to support those projects and that there are other activities that may have, may not directly be attributable to water quality outcomes, but which are still critical to delivering a program like this. And so that would also be considered as part of the design phase and as part of that gap analysis. So at some point then in the process, we hope by the end of April to, at the latest, to have been in a position to go back to those shortlisted delivery providers and to invite them to submit detailed project proposals based on the outcome of that regional planning process. And so that may be simply going back and asking people to give us a more detailed proposal based on their original EOI, or it could be for some variation of that to better align with the overall structure of the project. The intention then is to have projects underway by the end of June 2020. And as I say, to the extent that we are able to start projects earlier, then all the better. Ineligible activities, there's a number of things that are sort of spelt out in the agreement. Nothing that should be a surprise. Actions that commenced prior to the grant. That's not to say we can't build on projects that have previously been running, but we certainly won't be funding people for things that they have already done. On-ground activities outside the reef catchments are excluded, as is a duplication of funding. Perhaps the particularly important item to touch on around eligibility or ineligibility. So the EII sets out, you'll see there that it's activities are ineligible for funding that specifically enable an agricultural or other business to comply with their obligations under reef protection regulations made by the Queensland Government. So that wording that I've got there is explicitly, or is verbatim taken from the Reef Trust grant deed. So they're the requirements that have been set on the foundation, and so they then flow through to delivery providers and others who are funded. The intention of that, of course, is that the foundation is not funding people or organisations simply to comply with the law. So if somebody has a mandated requirement under the reef regulations to do something, then the expectation is that they would do that and they would not be being funded simply to comply with the law. Having said that, there is some grey around this, and our understanding certainly is that the provision is intended to exclude activities that are specifically designed to allow somebody to comply with their requirements. So it's where that funding is, I emphasise that word again, specifically designed to allow someone to comply with their requirements under the reef regulations. And we understand that it's not intended to exclude activities that may incidentally result in somebody complying with the regulations, It's also not intended to exclude activities that are supporting or encouraging somebody to go above and beyond those minimum requirements, but which may incidentally mean that they are also on the way complying with their regulatory requirements. So we are seeking some further advice and further clarification on this, and we'll have that available through that detailed design phase. And at that stage, if need be, we'll look at projects on a case-by-case basis. But for the purposes of your expressions of interest, rely on the advice that is set out there on that slide and in the guidelines. So what can be funded? Broadly, we are, all options for the most part are on the table. And again, I'd stress that not to be distracted by the interventions that are captured by the alluvium report. That modelling assumes certain levels of cost effectiveness for particular interventions. That does not mean that the more or the less cost effective approaches won't be considered. So by way of an example, the alluvium modelling suggests that retention basins recycle pits for catching tailwater runoff would be less cost effective than practice change. And so we've used those assumptions in some of our modelling. That does not mean that we exclude or limit ourselves to those most cost effective ones as per the alluvium numbers. And as I said before, if somebody comes forward with a proposal for a recycle pit, which they can demonstrate will be cost effective compared with any of the other proposals that come forward, then we're very open to funding that. We are also open to funding costs associated with landholder incentives. So these are eligible, and I note that specifically here because they were excluded in the early investment round. However, we will, as for all investments, all grants, be looking for an applicant to demonstrate a clear link between any expenditure and water quality outcomes. We will not be interested in proposals which are simply about spending money or adopting approach with the hope that it will achieve something. We want to see that there is a very strong link between whatever activity and whatever expenditure there is and whatever outcome we plan to get, and we'll be expecting delivery providers to be accountable for those outcomes. So the assessment criteria for delivery providers, so the first is around cost effectiveness, and so we've touched on that a number of times, and that is looking at the cost effectiveness based on the long-term average reduction in the target pollutant at the end of the basin divided by the cost. And the cost that we're interested in here is the cost to the foundation, primarily the cost of our investment. So to the extent that there is in-kind cost that you as an organisation or that landholders may make, for the purposes of this assessment, that would not be captured, because ultimately we're trying to understand what is the load that we will reduce for the investment that we make. We note in the document, in the guidelines, a couple of different ways that you might present this information. One is to rely on the values that Alluvium have included in its report, which is available. So you'll find in there indicative cost effectiveness, or cost effectiveness is not so much the issue as the effectiveness. So what the load reduction associated with particular intervention types would be for different catchments. So we'd welcome you to use those numbers if they are appropriate. Second possibility is to use the paddock to reef projector tool, for those familiar with that. So again, that allows someone to input a particular project and for it to calculate what a load reduction associated with particular actions might be. For those of you that have not used it before and do not have login details, please contact us through the grants email, or otherwise contact Adam Northey at DAF. If you know him directly, he's aware of that we're doing this and that the tool might be used for that. Or alternatively, it's open for you to put forward your own basis for how you've come up with your assessment of cost effectiveness. But we are looking for something robust. Clearly, we are looking, to the extent that you're going to do that, we want to understand what the basis for how you've calculated your numbers, what the data you've used is, what the science or what the methodology that you've used, so that we can understand the assumptions that underpin any of your assumptions around what you expect the project to achieve for the investment requested. The second assessment criteria is around demonstrated ability of the applicant. I think it is, self-explanatory. I won't talk further on that. And then the third criteria is around the proven effectiveness of the approach. And that is not to say that we are only interested in approaches that have been proven, but clearly that is an important consideration. For things that are speculative, I would encourage you to instead look at things like the innovation round. This funding is focused primarily on doing things that we know work well, but trying to do them better. So the process and timeframes. So applications, of course, close 29th of October. Open on the 29th of October and close on the 29th of November. Applications need to be submitted through tenders.net, so please follow the instructions there. Also grateful if you would follow the instructions we had about naming of files that are set out in the EOI guidelines. That certainly helps us greatly in sorting and managing things. And again, for delivery providers, the intention is to notify shortlisted applicants, those who have passed the minimum requirements, by the middle of February. In terms of the Program Manager and Partnership Coordinator role, we've talked about that in some length and the reasons for the split and so on, so I won't labour the point here. There is much more detail in the request for proposal around the different roles. So for those of you who may have only looked at the EOI for the delivery provider roles, if you're trying to better understand the governance arrangements, I'd encourage you to also download the request for proposals and have a look at, there's a detailed table in there which sets out the scope of work for the Program Manager and the Partnership Coordinator. The RFP requirements for the Program Manager and the Partnership Coordinator, they're spelled out there, but again, I think they're all self-explanatory. I won't labour the point here. I would note for the Program Manager and Partnership Coordinator roles, from a pricing perspective, we're asking for a 12-month firm price, including a detailed breakdown of what makes up that price, and then prices and pricing methodology for subsequent years. That's just reflecting the uncertainty, I'm sure, that there would be for those putting forward for this sort of role, committing for a 4-year plus period, or 4.5-year period, and there's uncertainty obviously regarding number of further grant rounds and other things that might happen. So that's the intention of looking for pricing in this way. We're also, for the Program Manager and Partnership Coordinator, looking for pricing methodology in the event that the program size expands and the area expands to capture those additional catchments. So as some indicative funding, we've just suggested that you consider if there was a further $10 million of funding available. So for example, in the Mackay Whitsunday region, if there was an additional $10 million that was then available to the Proserpine and O'Connell catchments, what would that mean for you as Program Manager / Partnership Coordinator? What would be the basis for scaling up to that? We're also looking for a breakdown, of course, if you're applying for both roles, so that we can see what it would mean in the event that you were only appointed to one of those roles. The assessment, again, is reasonably straightforward. We're interested in value for money, capability, experience, methodology, key personnel. Overall, though, we're, as I stressed before, we're outcomes focused and looking at what is going to be the best outcome for the program. The dates there, again, I won't labour on those. They're the same dates that we've touched on. From a probity perspective, just stress that we're looking to be fair and equitable with everyone and consistent with the information that we provide, and so therefore we ask that all questions you have come through that grants email address. We'll respond to them as quickly as we can, and we'll be posting responses to all questions de-identified on tenders.net. And you should already have received an update, I think yesterday, for at least one question that was addressed there. If you are intending to apply for a grant, then please do make sure that you have registered on tenders.net so that you do get those updates, both of responses to questions, but also any other changes that might come through. That's me for now until I get on to the questions. I think we have 4 questions, and I've got Anna's now just being passed up those, so you just have to bear with us for a moment while I digest them and work out an answer. So the first question I have is, as a grower, how can I present an organic sugarcane system into this program? So what we're looking for, obviously, is how whatever the proposed approach would impact on reducing the priority pollutants. And so in this instance, I guess the comparison would be between an existing baseline, whatever for example, a conventional farm. I guess this is assuming that the program would involve shifting a farm from conventional farming over to organic farming. And so we would be looking for the proposal to show how that would be done, how it would be achieved, the number of farms that would be involved, how many hectares would be involved, and what the change from the baseline, so what the current load coming off those conventional farms is at the moment, and how much that load would be reduced as a result of implementing an organic farming system. So that's what we'd be looking for. So that's what the cost effectiveness would be looking for. Noting that there's a minimum project size of $500,000 here. So as I mentioned before, that means that for something like this, we would assume that requires somebody to come forward as the lead organisation on this project, who could then bundle together a number of farms that would collectively achieve or implement this system, and where the total cost across those multiple farms was in excess of that $500,000 minimum. The next question is, are the load targets per year or total over the life of the project? So these load targets are the ongoing annual load reduction that would be achieved. The idea is that we would reach this by the end of the project life, but from a modelling perspective, the way the paddock to reef modelling system works is it assumes that for a particular land use in a particular region, that there will be a particular load that comes off that paddock, whether that is sediment or whether that's nitrogen or pesticides, based on the topography and various other things, and the modelling will then calculate how much of that reaches the end of the catchment. What we are looking here, so our targets here are through that modelling system. At the end of the process, we would look to have updated the land use practices to say, okay, on this 1,000 hectares. Previously it was, the land use was X, it is now Y. The model then calculates what that means for what runs off the paddock. The model then calculates what that means for how much is transmitted down the catchment to the end of the catchment. And we then have a before and after on what the load reaching the end of the catchment is. So those are what the targets are. So they are different from what the end of the paddock is. They're at the end of the catchment. The intention is that that would be a load reduction that is achieved every year though, assuming that that practice is maintained. Every year you would have that reduction from what the baseline was. There's a question, do we have a breakdown on the target load reductions between insecticides and herbicides? No, we don't. And look, I would note that the target set, particularly in the pesticide space, I'm not sure how to describe this. We contemplated not including any targets at all at one stage because of the different types of chemicals, because of the changing approach that is now being adopted to the way risks associated with pesticides are considered. I would, I guess, say that in putting forward proposals that relate to pesticides, I would not overly focus on the pesticide load amounts here. That's different for the nitrogen and for the sediment. But for the pesticides, there are other considerations that we're open to consider around what the effectiveness is of the method in terms of what we're taking out of the system or as to which ones that we are taking out. Yes, and we'd just note that the water quality risk framework addresses much of how you might go about that. I have another question here, which I'm not sure I fully understand. Will there be any mention or reference to the mercury-related schitan pollution? I don't know what that question means, I'm sorry. And look, it's not one of the priority pollutants that we are looking to address here. So I think the short answer is that we are not addressing that. And look, those are the only questions that had come through during the course of the call. Let me just see if there's anything else. Okay, so we have a few more questions that are coming through. So let me just, as I say, just bear with us a second while we deal with them. So we have a question that says, some services can only be costed once design is done, such as water quality monitoring. This would make it difficult to quote and meet the cost-effective criteria. That'll depend on the overall scope and scale as per the design. Look, that's fine. We recognise limitations of doing things, but it's an expression of interest process that we're running here. And I guess what we're asking people to do is to put forward their best foot forward based on what they think a project might look like, but stressing it is only an EOI phase, and so we want people to be realistic in that. If there are multiple scales something could operate at, and you're comfortable to present a couple of different project scales and what that might mean for costing, then that's fine. And obviously the firm quote we're looking for is something that will come at a later phase when the design has been done, and we can go back to delivery providers or others and say, okay, well, now provide us a detailed proposal for that. Sorry, Sorry, you just have to bear with us. So we have a question: can an organisation be both regional program manager as well as a delivery provider? I guess the short answer is yes. We haven't excluded it, but come back to my earlier point, we would want to see how someone was proposing that they could do that and deal with the objectives that we'd set down for the program and any of the concerns, particularly here related to conflicts of interest. So this, that is a particularly challenging role would be particularly challenging for somebody to step forward in both of those roles, I would expect, because on the one hand, it would mean that they are leading the design of the program and then putting their hand forward to say, these are the activities that I will then implement. And there's obviously conflicts in that. And equally, it would mean that they are then need to put forward a way of how they would be managing themselves. But ultimately, as I say, we are being flexible in the way we're approaching this. We'll ultimately look for the best outcome for the program. And if somebody puts forward a proposal which would involve them doing that and the benefits outweigh the downside, then we will look at it. Do the catchments include the ocean or the bay areas or only the land? No, the catchments are only focused on the land, so it's not related to water that is done, not related to activities that are done out over the water. I'm just reading along the question here. Okay, so the question says, NRM recently announced a program with no winners, citing a failure to meet the unspecified innovation criteria. Can you please talk to what RTP is looking for in regards to known activities, or is it a known activity with some innovation, fundamental research to support and sustain longest term decision making, extending a little further on the term, what is known to work? I guess ultimately, if you're putting forward a proposal as a delivery provider, you need to be able to convince us that what you want us to invest in will work. I guess this is not an innovation round. There is a separate innovation round to look at, more out of the box ideas and more, risky approaches, which are going to be, where there'll be greater acceptance that things won't work. Here we are very much looking on building on things that have worked somewhere, and that we have, a reasonably high degree of confidence that things will work. So we are, we're certainly also interested in the extent that people are pushing the boundary somewhat in those approaches, and when we're open to that. But this investment, this $140 million and the 22 million in Mackay, 19.5 million in the Fitzroy, at the end of the investment, we want to achieve those target load reductions that we've set out. So we want to have sufficient confidence in whatever the activity is that you put forward that you're going to be able to make it happen. That doesn't mean that we have to have known about the activity necessarily, but there needs to be sufficient confidence that what you're going to do will work. I hope that answers the question. I have a question here. How do the innovation ideas and proposals feed into this process, given that it's a separate EI application? So they will be run separately, and I guess it comes back to the sort of the bite-sized chunks thing. I'd also note that the innovation funding will be across the whole reef catchment space. So it won't be limited only to these regions. So people could have put forward for proposals elsewhere. We will, though, be looking, to align and to build in as best we can. And so from a timing perspective, we will have our short list of innovative, ideas and concepts and so on by early next year, at the time that we are going through the detailed design for these regional programs. And so if we see that there is a innovation project that's been put forward, which could be integrated into one of these regional programs, and we'd very much be looking to do that. We're certainly looking to build the linkages across the programs wherever we can. So I think there's opportunities within the innovation round, if people are putting forward a proposal there, to talk about how that could fit in and build into a regional program. And equally, if you're putting forward a proposal as a delivery provider under this EOI, then again, we're open to those proposals identifying potential linkages to other more innovative approaches that you might be looking to propose and put forward separately. Can I comment on the potential liability of taking on the management and/or coordinator role if the delivery contracts are between the GBRF and the delivery agent? I mean, the liability of the program manager and the coordinator is to implement their tasks as set out in the contract that they will have with GBRF, which will be to deliver the scope of works that are set out in the request for proposal. So that's what the responsibility will be for those organisations. Whoever is the program manager or the partnership coordinator, they don't and won't have a contractual arrangement with the delivery agents. So they're not responsible for what the delivery agents do, and that's part of what this model is about. It's retaining that responsibility and that risk with the foundation, and so it's a lesser responsibility, but still a very important responsibility that sits with the program manager and the partnership coordinator. So they are responsible for making sure the delivery providers, well, for tracking the delivery providers, for advising the foundation. I guess we're trying to encourage the delivery providers to do all they can, to assist them in doing all they can to implement their projects in the most effective and efficient way, and to keeping the foundation informed of that progress and advising the foundation if there are any issues. Next question. So the question, ultimately reef outcomes are going to be determined by how any project outcomes are sustained. Would RF, it says RFP, I assume that means the RFT, so the reef, the request for proposal. I'm not sure if it's a request for proposal or if it's the RTP, the Reef Trust Partnership. It could be either, but anyway, would we consider a project that focused on sustaining outcomes from projects that might be supported by GBRF rather than a technical project itself? Yes, we are open to that. I touched briefly on it before, that we recognise that there is a need for that infrastructure, for want of a better word, to support these programs just generally, that can enhance their effectiveness and can support things like their longevity of outcomes and their sustainability. So yes, we would consider that. So the challenge there is obviously around thinking about what the cost effectiveness of those are, and where you have projects that don't have a direct cost effectiveness outcome, but what I guess we would want would be the proposal to talk about how this approach, this methodology would contribute, and it's what the alternative would be if you didn't have this project in place, how it would compare to, I guess, that situation. If you can demonstrate that there is, for example, a significant degree of disadoption that goes on, and what that might mean in terms of going backwards towards our pollution targets, and that through this approach that you would prevent that or mitigate that, then that would be the type of cost effectiveness assessment that we'd be looking at. So we still will want those sorts of projects to be able to show how they can link through in some way. I realise it's indirect, it's, you know, it's more challenging to do, but we'd need to see something that shows that connection. Just going to put it here. That's missing. That's all I think that one's dealt with. That was just the second part of the question. If an organisation has governance systems and methodology and experience in place for the PM role, but would need to employ additional staff to meet the new work requirements, is that okay? Because that means the CV of the person won't be available. They can only be employed until we know they've been appointed. Well, you can apply for the role as an organisation, but obviously one of the criteria that we have is around who are the people that will be actually doing the work, because that matters. So organisations are important, but individuals are very important. And so you're obviously open to put forward a proposal to say, we'd take this PM role and here's our organisational ability, here's how we would go about it, and here's what it would cost, and we can assess based on those things. But that sort of proposal would not score well in terms of the actual personnel, to the extent that there's one of the assessment criteria will be about the actual individual that's filling that role. Next question. In relation to the program manager role, it's acknowledged key responsibilities in the ongoing management of delivery providers. Is there a legal arrangement between the program manager and the delivery partner to allow a contractual legal framework to administer that? No, there won't be any direct legal agreement put in place between the program manager role and the delivery providers. To the extent that the program manager is filling that function, it would be as an agent on behalf of the foundation, so acting with responsibility on behalf of the foundation, who does have a contract in place with those partners. So that would be the nature of that relationship. Question, is the amount or percentage of co-contributions defined? No, there's no mandatory requirement here. I think this question relates to the RFP, to the request for proposal, so the program manager partnership coordinator role. There's simply space that is included in the standard form, which allows you to include any co-contributions that you might be making, which we're obviously interested to see and consider as part of the assessment, but there's no mandatory amount or requirement there. Next question, once delivery providers are knocked out at the EOI stage, does that mean they cannot be involved in the planning process or the design? No, that's not the case at all. We'll still be open to having a wide range of people involved, and really, I guess, anyone who's interested in being involved in that process. Yes, we can. Those people or those organisations can still be very much involved. It also doesn't preclude people from the possibility of being involved in subsequent grant rounds. So for these programs, we won't necessarily be committing the full funding that's available through this process, that there may be a further funding round in 12 months' time. There may be opportunities for other organisations to put forward proposals then. It really depends on the approach and that we take at the time, what the design that comes out. Next question, the successful program manager organisation may actually be in competition with some of the project providers. How will this conflict be managed? So I think if I understand the question, that means not competition in part of this program, but more broadly outside in other activities that they may be competing. Look, I think everyone is requested to put forward a conflict of interest as part of the process, and certainly we will need that from the program manager for them to submit conflict of interest. And then I guess more particularly when we move into that design phase, we will need to better understand what the relationship is between the program manager in leading that process and the potential delivery providers. And look, I guess I can't say much more than that now at this point, other than we're very mindful of being aware of and addressing conflicts. We're also conscious that the reef space is a relatively small one, and that it is inevitable that there are many organisations who have different roles and different relationships with one another, and that we simply will need to work through that as we come to it. That was a different question. Now I think we've accidentally just deleted one question. So if I don't know whether we can recover it. I didn't see who it was from. So if I get to the end of the questions and I haven't answered your question, then that was probably, and it hasn't been answered some other way, then that was you, and please, we're not ignoring you, just resend it. What level of risk will rest with the program manager if they are unable to manage a delivery partner to meet their milestone? Look, the risk really sits with the delivery partner and with the foundation. So, we expect, obviously, the program manager to do all that they can to try and structure, to assist the foundation in setting up the program in the way that will is most likely to result in success. That we have, robust activity designs for different activities. That the program manager is taking appropriate interest in how that activity is progressing. That they have identified the risks that exist with different activities. That they are monitoring those. They're working with delivery providers to address them and reporting back to the foundation on the status of those activities and where they're at. From a contractual perspective, I guess to go back to the response I had earlier to a similar sort of question, ultimately the risk of or the responsibility of the program manager is for them to deliver the scope of works that are set out in the request for proposals, and to do that, to a high standard, the standard would expect. We recognise that the program manager can't make the delivery partners meet all of their obligations, and it's the delivery partners who are accountable for doing that. And I guess that's inherent in the type of model that we've set up. That there's an important role that we've carved off for the program manager, but it's different from what it would have been if we simply were funding a program manager $20 million and having them subcontracting all the delivery providers. What proportion of a project can be funded? Is the Reef Foundation looking for match funding or additional investment from delivery providers? We can invest 100%, we can invest 10%. All options are available. From our perspective, ultimately, we're looking at what's the value that we get from our investment. That comes back to looking at the cost effectiveness. If something is, achieving a substantial benefit, on a dollar per unit basis or units per dollar basis, then it doesn't really matter to us if we're investing all of it or if there is some in-kind contribution. If there is funding from other donors, then we would need to, pick that apart to understand the, I guess, sort of the attribution of our investment, what the the additionality that was coming from our investment would be. But, you know, the short answer is we can fund 100% of projects, but, you know, very pleased to have co-funded projects or in-kind contributions. Why would there not be opportunities to incept the pollutants once they leave the rivers and are heading towards the reef? I'm not sure. I think this is coming back to, will the open innovation funding be open to water or open ocean-based solutions or only land also? I mean, in terms of the, so this is the same question, and I guess it relates back to the earlier question about whether it's limited to the, you know, land-based activities or not. Certainly in my understanding, there have been no investments made, no activities undertaken to try and address nitrogen or sediment or pesticides once they are out in the open ocean. I'm not familiar with any activities that have been done of that kind. As a result, for these regional programs, which are focused on things where we have a you know, high level of confidence that they will work, that's not something that we're contemplating as part of this round. As for the question on will the innovation funding be open to, you know, ocean-based solutions, might take that question on notice, and we'll think about that as we finalise the innovation round. In principle, I can't see why not, but I also can't see exactly what that sort of activity might look like, but would be open to having a sort of a more specific conversation with the, you know, with the questioner on that at the time. Okay, I see someone's now putting up some suggestions around seaweed ocean farms and so on. So again, from the for this particular program that we're talking about, I'm not aware of the extent to which they've been shown to reduce that end of load catchment, and that's certainly what we're focused on for these regional programs. And as I say, we'll take on notice and can have a conversation later on the other. So there's a follow-up question on the question of not having a detailed design at this stage, and how can you assess the cost effectiveness? But we've got that in our selection criteria. Again, you know, I acknowledge that, but it is only an EOI process. We need people to put forward. We're just asking people to put forward the best of the information, best that they've got, and then we'll move on into the design phase and look more closely at explicitly what the cost effectiveness is. So, you know, I recognise that people don't know exactly what a project will cost until we move on further, but we need to factor in at a high level, at the very least, what we think something's going to cost and what something's going to achieve before we can, you know, as part of this initial vetting process. So that's all the questions I have here. As I say, I think we accidentally deleted someone's question that we may not have responded. So I have a question that's just come through. Intuitively, you know that certain practices greatly benefit water quality, but there may be a lack of quantifiable data to verify water quality improvement. Is there some flexibility to do trial work in conjunction with implementing best management practices? Yes is the short answer. So very open to proposals, projects that involve both some of the sort of the tried and true, and also a little bit of the expanding things, testing things at the margins. We then start moving into the, I guess, the grey zone of what we fund here versus what we want to look at through the innovation space. So it's really, I guess it's a more limited scope here. You know, it's much more focused on that, what does work, and I guess primarily if you want to trial something, suggest that you look more at the innovation round, but we'd certainly look to try and bring the two together the best we can through the design phase. So that's again all the questions that I've got here. So if you have another question, or if you put in a question you don't think it's been fully answered, please please come again at us. Just to re-emphasise on the response I had there about the trials and so on, is that very much this round is around testing the things, or implementing the things that we know work and that we've got confidence will work, and that the trials predominantly should be, or the trials should be coming through the innovation space. I mean, we can look at and work with the program manager as part of the design about how we best integrate those things, but very much focusing here on the things that we think will work, and that where there is data to support that, because we are mindful that there are lots of things out there that we all think work, and that, as the question said, intuitively we expect will work, but the challenge is understanding the cost effectiveness of those things. And there are lots of approaches. You know, I guess what immediately comes to mind is in the space of soil health. Had lots of discussions with many landholders and delivery providers around improving soil health as a means for improving water quality outcomes, and I think we are all in agreement that that will improve water quality. But in terms of funding those sorts of activities, if we don't know what their cost effectiveness is, then it's very hard to compare them. And so to the extent that there are approaches that don't have that supporting data, then we would encourage them to apply through the innovation space as a way of demonstrating that things that we might think will work will actually work. So again, we're through our questions. So we'll just pause for another minute or two in case somebody's cogitating or coming up with a further question or trying to type something down. And otherwise we'll, and while I wait to say that, I've just been informed that the updates go on the GBRF website, not on tenders.net. So which updates are we talking about? Oh, the FAQs, sorry. So the FAQs, so all the questions and the responses, so including any of the responses that we type up from today, they will be all on the website. They are not on tenders.net. So that's the source for that. If there's change to any of the documentation or changes, for example, to the submission, the closing date or things like that, then they would come out through tenders.net. Now, I've had no further questions come through, so I'll assume that that's a good sign and that everyone knows all that they need to know. So look, thank you very much for your time today, and especially thank you for your interest in the program. Very pleased to have such a large number of people on the call today. Very much look forward to seeing your proposals as they come in and working with you all over the coming years. So thanks all, and we'll sign off now. Going.